Hello, good evening all, and welcome to the Virtual Student Activity Conference. My name is Michelle McGehee. I am the Biology State Contest Director, and in this presentation we're going to go over test format and do a topics overview as well. So if you were listening to Capitol Conference, or if you have already seen our first videos for science that came out a couple of weeks ago, then you have already seen this. But since we're doing test format, I want to go ahead and emphasize the types of questions in terms of Bloom's taxonomy that you would find on the UIL biology portion. So most of the test is going to be knowledge and comprehension and application and analysis. That makes up about 75% of the test. There are some harder questions that are the synthesis and evaluation type questions. And so when we're looking at a 20-question portion of the overall science test, we're talking about 5 questions or about 5 questions that are pretty tough relative to the test type. And then also we've got 75% of the test, or 15 questions, that are from these 2 categories. Now this is the general question difficulty levels, but please be aware that the Invitational A test will probably have fewer than 5 synthesis and evaluation type questions, whereas the state test might have maybe 6 or 7 synthesis and evaluation type questions. So I'd like to spend a little bit of time going through my vision for each of these tests. For example, Invitational A, this is going to provide a nice foundation for content that you will find on the district test. We'll talk about Invitational B in the next slide, but Invitational B will also do the same. So the type of content that you can find on Invitational A is basic content. This is going to be things like terms, what is this, what is made in this process. It's going to be very basic, provide the baseline, and also there's going to be very few higher level questions. So when we looked at that graph earlier, this means that there are going to be fewer than 5 questions. And let's go back to that graph that come from synthesis and evaluation. Okay, so some helpful hints for Invitational A. The bolded terms in the textbooks are incredibly helpful. If you don't know what the term is, then it's very difficult to figure out what the question is talking about. And so having those definitions, knowing those terms, is going to be really helpful for figuring out some of these questions. Also, basic facts on cellular processes or evolutionary processes, as just a few examples, and then basic facts also on concepts. So Invitational A, out of all of the tests, is going to by far be the easiest. The next test is going to be Invitational B. And in Invitational B, we're going to expand upon the content type from Invitational A. So what that means is, as I've looked through the topics list, you'll note also that there are subtopics. And I try to, between Invitational A and Invitational B, if I try not to use the same subtopic in both of these tests, because these tests are really setting the foundation for the remaining 3, so district, regional, and state. And so what I want to do is provide a broad overview of the types of content that can show up on these tests. It's going to be more difficult than Invitational A. When I first wrote tests, my Invitational A and B were equivalent in terms of difficulty level. And the feedback that we got from coaches and students was that there needed to be a step up in the Invitational B because district is going to step up on top of that. And so it was too much of a jump in my first test, writing that from the invitational test to the district test was too much of a jump in terms of difficulty level. And so since then, I have spread this out where Invitational A is the easiest, B then is a step up from that, and then district is going to be a step up from both of those. Students should not expect 25% higher level questions on Invitational B as well. There will probably be maybe 3 or 4 of those higher level questions. But again, the bolded terms are going to be important because we're introducing new content. and again, basic facts, but also making those connections in the content. So for the district test, this is going to expand upon both A and B content. So generally, after I've created invitational A and B, and I'm ready to create the district test, then I will sit down and look at the content that came up on invitationals A and B. Most of the time, I will choose something similar in content type. Maybe I will look at the incorrect answers for the invitational questions and figure out how I can construct a question for the district test out of those. And so often it's, of course, our foundation has been supplied by the invitational A and B content. There might be some extra content that comes in depending on which subtopics that I'm choosing. But a lot of the time, the district test, the questions are going to piggyback off of invitational questions. So again, the best thing to do would be to look up, I'm down here at these hints bullet point, to look up the content for the answers that are incorrect on invitational tests and understand why they're incorrect, but also understand what I'm talking about. So in our third session here in October, we will be going through some practice questions. So I'm not going to reference any particular question at this time. I'll just say, look at those answer choices and find out the information in those answer choices. Also, understand why the answers on the invitational test are correct, and maybe turn that around and think, okay, what could make it incorrect? Or are there certain situations where this answer would not always apply? On the district test, we're also going to have more higher level questions. There will probably be 4 or 5 of those synthesis and evaluation questions. And we're going to introduce a little bit of new content for regional and state. So many of the questions will piggyback off the content in A and B, and that A and B content will be consistent also as we get through district and probably regional. State tends to be quite different, but we'll talk about that in a few. And the new content that gets introduced from the district test will help support the regional and state topics that we're covering. And so this is going to expand our foundation a little bit as we reach towards those more advanced tests, the regional and the state test. So we look at the regional test, definitely more higher level questions. So we're talking 5 to 6. Advanced content from previous tests. So when I write this test, the regional test, I'm looking at the district test and I'm looking at the invitational test and I'm asking myself, what can make this question more difficult? Would it be a scenario? Instead of asking, what is this? Perhaps I could ask a student how to apply this. And so students at that point would need to definitely be making those connections among either different topics or within that same topic, not just knowing how it works or being able to understand how it works, but being able to actually apply how it works to a specific situation. And that's where those higher level questions are coming from as well. So some helpful hints for the regional tests. Ask yourself, as you look through invitational questions and district questions, what can make this question more difficult? So you could look at the question itself and try to figure out a way to make that question more difficult. Would I leave some information out that the student, I would assume by the time a student reaches the regional test, they would probably know? Or perhaps one of those incorrect answers could become a correct answer in a very specific situation. Also, connecting the concepts and topics lists will start to blur. So we'll find as we reach these more advanced tests, the regional and the state, that the topics become less discrete. And what I mean by that is we can create questions that will cover or could be classified in multiple subtopic areas. And that starts to happen in the regional exam. And then by the time we get to the state test, the topics blur even more. So while I will try to keep myself on track as I'm test writing and make sure that I'm hitting good topic areas and I'm not focusing on one topic more than another, they will start to blur in terms of how we can categorize them. There will definitely be more analysis of information given. Students will also need quite a bit of prior knowledge to answer some of these questions. And for reference also, when we talked about the 3 different categories for the types of questions that could show up on the test, we had the level 1, level 2, and level 3 type questions, level 3 being that 25% category that was in yellow. Please understand that depending on the test, the level 1 difficulty will be different. So a level 1 question on an invitational A is not going to be the same in terms of difficulty as a level 1 question on a state test. It's just how the question is asked. Right? In terms of the state test, there's going to be very few what is this type of questions. So there will be fewer questions that are reliant upon students knowing bolded terms, asking a definition question, I guess is what I'm saying here. Students obviously will need to know those bolded terms, but they're not going to be asked too many of those level 1 questions that are just, what is this? They're going to be asked more about how to apply it or how to think critically about a particular scenario. And that's where we get into the greater than 25% of higher level questions. So those level 3 questions, there will at least be 5 on the state test. There might even be 6 or 7. There's always on the state test at least one really out there question. And this will pull in information that maybe it's never been addressed on invitationals or the district or the region. And so it will be something that just comes out of the blue on the state test. And that's really to try to separate out those scores a little bit. Because in the end, as much as we want everybody to get 100% on all of these exams, it is a contest, and so we need to be able to separate those scores out. Right? So some helpful hints for the state test: be able to make connections among topics. That's the critical thinking aspect. It's hard to teach critical thinking from a coach and a teacher perspective. It's something that students have to practice over and over again, being able to make those connections. And also, probably one of the most common things I've said as we've talked about these different tests is to look at the incorrect answers from previous tests. It's not that every question that I'm building on every test has a precursor question from a different exam, but that is where I tend to get my inspiration. So if I'm writing the state test, I'm going back to all 4 of those previous tests and I'm thinking, okay, how can I make it harder? And is one of these incorrect answers, can I build an entirely new question off of one of these? And that tends to be where my inspiration is. And I think that's more helpful for me because it makes the tests, all 5 of these exams, more relatable to each other as a set. Okay, moving on. We know that there are 10 main topics for the biology portion of the test. And our first 2 topics here are the relationship between structure and function in cellular and acellular replication. So in terms of topic number 1, we're talking about maybe basic biochemistry, cell biology, so the parts of the cell, maybe the functions of each of those parts, membranes and membrane function, also transport across the membrane, and function of organic macromolecules as well. So students can expect questions that might have structures on them, or maybe ask where you might find a particular structure. Topic number 2 is cellular and acellular replication. And in cellular and acellular replication, we're talking about the cell cycle, regulation of the cell cycle, DNA replication processes, and that includes the molecular genetics component of this. So things like the enzymes that are involved in replication, or some facts maybe about the DNA molecule being anti-parallel, or replication itself being semi-conservative and bidirectional, genome structure, and then cell division processes like meiosis with sexual reproduction, and also the viral replication cycles, and this can include viruses that infect bacteria, so the bacteriophage replication cycles, such as the lytic and lysogenic cycle. It might include human or animal viruses as well. Okay, we also have energy transformations, and this will include all of metabolism, which includes both anabolic and catabolic activities. Cellular respiration, photosynthesis, those are great pathways for energy transformation. There's lots going on in cellular respiration and photosynthesis, but I would also include the fermentation pathways and energy transformations as well. And then some information about enzymes, since they are the main players here in metabolic processes. So it could be enzyme structure. We might be talking about what is an allosteric site or what is an active site, or maybe some helpers, some prosthetic groups for those enzymes. Gene expression is topic number 4, and gene expression can include protein synthesis, which includes both the processes of transcription and translation. It can also include regulation of gene expression. In the past, I've gone into some of the classic regulation mechanisms, the negative and positive control and the lac operon, just in general negative and positive control. But I've also been specific with the lac operon and the arginine operon as well. And so those might reappear at some point. And then effects of mutations. So what are mutations? What types of mutations can occur? What are the potential impacts of those mutations? Topic number 5 is genetics and inheritance. So we start to get into the transmission side, where we're looking at Mendelian inheritance patterns and non-Mendelian inheritance patterns, so things that are outside of the classical genetics here. This will include genetic crosses. I'm also including DNA technology in this area as well. So I tend to have at least one question that relates to either PCR, maybe RT-PCR, gel electrophoresis. And as we've advanced through tests, I think I've even included some of the blotting, so northern blotting, southern blotting, western blotting. So just some of that technology. Western blot wouldn't be a DNA technology. It would be more under protein here. But there could be a DNA technology component to it as to get to that point where you would need to perform a Western blot. Okay, topic number 6 is evolution, and this will include natural selection and those forces that drive evolutionary processes, reproductive success, microevolutionary events including selection, mutation, recombination, migration, genetic drift, and gene flow. Evidence of macroevolution, including speciation and extinction, and then also evidence for unity and diversity. I think the classic that pops in my mind every time I think about this subtopic is the forearm of mammals. So there's a comparison of the bones of mammals such as bats, whales, cats, horses, and humans. And you can see quite a bit of unity in the structure of those bones, even though the organisms are quite diverse. Topic number 7 is origin and diversity of life. So we're talking taxonomy, our classification of organisms, or our attempt to classify all this diverse all of these diverse living entities. We have the domains of life. So remember that there are 3 domains. This particular topic is also where supergroups would show up, and we haven't talked about supergroups in a while, and I don't anticipate excuse me, and I don't anticipate adding supergroup questions to these exams in this this UIL year either. But if you look at old tests of mine, you will see some references to supergroups, and this is the topic area where it came from. Animal and plant behavior, I don't tend to focus on plants that much. I try to put something in there because I know students have an interest in plants. Some students have interest in plants, so I try to provide some, but my inclination is to focus more on animals or bacteria. So in plant behavior here, I would be looking for things like some of the plant hormones, the auxins, for example, so on and so forth. But also biological hierarchy, which includes looking at the differences in definition between populations and communities. As we start, for of course, the basic unit of life as being the cell, and we build upon that. From cells we get tissues, and then we get organs, and then organ systems, and then the organism. So that is part of the biological hierarchy. Okay, topic number 8 is ecology and the environment. So this will include population biology. Hardy-Weinberg type genetics might fall into this category, or I could categorize it in our genetics topic that was earlier. I think it was topic number 5. Community dynamics, so how organisms in a community interact. Organism relationships, again, that goes back to some of that community dynamics. Biogeochemical cycles, things like the phosphorus cycle, sulfur cycle, nitrogen cycle. And then ecosystem stability. So what are some factors, physical factors, or maybe even some intrinsic factors that affect the stability of a particular ecosystem? Number 9, basic human anatomy and physiology. Tissue types and corresponding cell types. So epithelial tissue, muscle tissue, nervous tissue, connective tissue. Being able to categorize that blood is a connective tissue, and bone is also a connective tissue. Epithelial tissue is what's lining the inside and outside of body cavities, and also skin, and the types of cells that you might find in different areas. Regulation for homeostasis. We've got regulation of homeostasis, so knowing some of those hormones. Some of the bigger players, like what would regulate blood glucose levels, would probably show up in maybe some of the earlier tests. Probably something more advanced for the state test, maybe more thyroid related for the state test. And the effects of imbalance, what happens when insulin levels are not regulated, what happens to blood sugar levels, that kind of thing. And then organ systems, and I say any of them, and this was something that was new last year. Prior to last year, I was only looking at specific organ systems, and I decided that it felt very limited. I felt very limited in the amount of questions I could ask from this topic, and so I went ahead and expanded out to any of the organ systems. Okay, and then our last topic here are the diseases, and these can include eukaryotic diseases. So these are diseases that are caused by eukaryotic organisms, including fungi, protists, or worms, the multicellular eukaryotic diseases as well. Viral diseases, bacterial diseases, pathogenesis. This is quite an advanced category, a subtopic for diseases, and so I've tended to kind of stay away from it. I'd rather provide a foundation about different disease types and maybe what or who it impacts, or maybe what tissue it impacts, as opposed to going into specific pathogenesis mechanisms. This is quite an involved area. Etiologic agents, so what is the name of the bacteria that causes whooping cough, for example? That would be an example of an etiologic agent. Disease signs or symptoms, again, with these differential diagnosis questions, that kind of is the same as pathogenesis, where it can get real complicated real quick and real advanced real quick. And so I think my focus with these tests is more etiological agents and then diseases, and staying away a little bit from pathogenesis and differential diagnosis. The focus this year will be on eukaryotic diseases. And so what I want students to know this year, and this was the same as what it was last year, but what I want students to know this year is that these are going to be, of course, diseases that are caused by eukaryotes. So don't just focus on protists and fungi, also look at the worms, but also how some of these diseases can be spread, because a lot of the protists can be spread via vectors, and some of the worms also can be spread via vectors. And so students should definitely know what a vector is and be able to tie in some of those diseases, the more common ones or more classic ones as we're studying these, to the vector if there is one. Okay, and also the focus will continue to do in the news, and there's quite a bit in the news right now concerning COVID, which is a viral disease, so that would still be fair because it's in the news, even though our second question from this category is a eukaryotic diseases. The in the news could be anything. It could be a bacterial disease, it could be a viral disease. But just because COVID-19 is in the news quite a bit right now doesn't mean that there's going to be a question related to it on every single test. So yes, it's important, obviously, for a lot of reasons, because it is a pandemic. Or in a pandemic situation, but I also want students to be able to filter out that and find some of the other items that are in the news that are maybe obscured because COVID is getting quite a bit of attention. So some places to go to find the in the news include CDC's website, the World Health Organization's website, local public health websites would also have some of the more global. I'm not going to focus on in the news for very local communities because these are statewide tests. I could focus on the state of Texas. I think that would be fair, but it wouldn't be fair necessarily to focus on public health coming out of Harris County, for example, only. So it would be maybe something Texas at least at the very minimum. The smallest geographic area I'd go would be the state of Texas. But it could also be anything that's happening across the United States. Perhaps there's an outbreak in 10 states of listeria. And so that could be popped up in the news on public health websites, the CDC website and World Health Organization. All right, so lastly, we've got some helpful hints here. And some of this I've already covered, but just to recap, remember that there are 20 questions in the biology portion of the test, and we have 10 topics. So there are usually 2 from each main topic, the exception being state and some of regional, where some of those questions can be categorized as different topics. They are almost never from the same subtopic in a single test. So if I go back up and let's look at evolution, for example. I will have 2 questions from evolution, but they will not both be about natural selection. Perhaps one will be about natural selection, then I'll come down here and another will be about speciation. And so I tend to spread that out over the single tests. Topics will become more blurred as the tests progress, especially at the state. So again, regional and state, especially state, topics are kind of almost become moot, but I still try to, when I build the test, look at the individual topics and subtopics. Questions will sometimes piggyback on content from other tests. So here was a study tip that's come up when we were talking about the test. Determine why the incorrect answers are wrong, or in what situation or context could they be correct. And then look up incorrect answers to learn more about them. So there might be an incorrect answer that seems really out there, and it's like, oh, I don't think that has, a student could say, oh, I don't think that has anything to do with what the question's asking. And instead of blowing it off, maybe whenever you get the test results back, actually look at that and try to determine some information about it. So look up what that question is, or that incorrect answer is asking or saying, to expand the knowledge base of what you have and provide maybe a wider foundation for yourself. Bolded words in textbooks are super helpful. This is going to create foundation. Bolded words are great for those first few tests, but knowing those words, knowing that I'm not going to ask what is the definition of this once we get past a certain point. I'm going to expect that you probably already know it. But for those invitational tests, this is a great way to provide a foundation. And then the diseases, again, the focus this year is going to be eukaryotes. So we've got worms, protists, fungi, and then don't forget about the vectors, things like ticks and mosquitoes and fleas. In the news, that's going to come from CDC, World Health Organization, National Institutes of Health, and also public health forums. Okay, so that concludes this PowerPoint presentation on the test form and also the topics list.